The morning it happened, Fiore did not so much wake up as get shoved awake. There is a hill 3 days' walk east of Magnolia, where the plains give way to broken country. Scrub pine, red clay, the kind of land nobody bothers naming, because nobody bothers living there. Farmers from the nearest village called it the Deadlands, not because anything dark had ever happened there, but because nothing had ever happened there at all. It was the emptiest place in eastern Fiore. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. At 6:14 in the morning, it stopped being empty. The old herders who saw it from a safe distance, 3 brothers driving a flock south before the heat came on, would spend the rest of their lives disagreeing about what they'd actually witnessed, but they agreed on the shape of it. First there was a sound, like the sky tearing along a seam nobody knew was there, a low groan that built into a shriek, and then, impossibly, into silence. Then the air over the hill turned the color of a fresh bruise. Purple shot through with sickly green, and within that bruised light something vast began to arrive. Not fall, not descend, but simply resolve. The way a word comes into focus when you finally understand a language you'd only been guessing at. Walls. Red stone walls, jagged and spiked, thick as a castle keep, and running for what looked like miles. Towers with banners that didn't belong to any nation the brothers had ever heard of. A stylized wolf skull on crimson and black, snapping in wind that hadn't been blowing a second before. And beneath the walls, spilling out in every direction like a wound the earth had just discovered it had, a city. Not a village, not a fortress, a city, teeming and enormous. Its rooftops a jumble of tents and longhouses, and towers of dark timber and darker stone. Cookfires already lit in 100 places, war horns still sounding somewhere deep within it, as if whatever had just happened to this place had happened to the people inside it too, and they hadn't finished reacting yet. The eldest of the 3 brothers would later tell the Rune Knights that the ground didn't shake so much as it exhaled, as though Earthland itself had taken a breath it didn't know it needed to hold, and only now let it out. Dust rolled off the new city in a slow gray tide, settling over red clay that had never known a footprint. Somewhere within those walls, something roared, deep and guttural, layered with rage and disorientation, and unmistakably not human. The brothers ran. Their sheep did not wait to be herded. They scattered on their own, which was, in retrospect, the smartest thing anyone did that morning. Orgrimmar had not asked to go anywhere. Warlord, no. War chief. The word steadied itself in her mind the way it always did, an old habit from a life she no longer entirely trusted the memory of. Sylvanas Windrunner stood on the balcony outside Grommish Hold with her hands folded behind her back, and watched her capital finish, arriving in a world that had no right to exist. She had felt the wrongness before anyone else had. A Banshee Queen's senses ran deeper than mortal ones, tuned to death and its textures, and what she'd felt in the seconds before the world changed was neither death nor magic as she understood it. It was something else, something foreign, laced through the residual scar tissue of the Argus Rift, like infection finding an old wound. The Legion campaign had left cracks in reality all across Azeroth, cracks the Army of the Light had sealed, the Alliance had cheered about, and everyone had agreed, with the particular relief of people who want very badly to stop fighting, were finally closed. They had not been as closed as anyone believed. Something had reached through one of those cracks, not Legion, not Void, not anything her scouts and warlocks could immediately name, and it had reached at the exact wrong moment, into the exact wrong seam, and dragged an entire city sideways out of the world it belonged to. Below her, Orgrimmar was in chaos, though it was a controlled chaos, the kind a war-forged city produces instead of panic. Orcish war drums beat out the assembly call across every district. Grunts poured from barracks half-dressed, weapons in hand, forming up on instinct before anyone had told them what they were forming up against. In the Valley of Wisdom, Trolls were already climbing to rooftops to get eyes on the horizon, tusks bared, shadow hunters murmuring prayers to Loa who, Sylvanas would bet her own life on it, had no idea where their supplicants had just been taken. Blood elves in the Elder Rise were casting detection spells in every direction, their voices sharp with the particular alarm of people whose magic has just stopped behaving the way it's supposed to. Because that was the first thing Sylvanas had confirmed. In the 10 minutes since the world went strange, the ambient magic here was wrong. Not absent, not suppressed. Wrong. Thicker in some places and thinner in others, structured around something her blood elf magisters were calling, with visible unease, lines, as if magic in this place ran on rails instead of simply existing in the air the way it did at home. Warchief. Grukthar Bloodfist came up the stairs 2 at a time, axe still in hand, breathing hard. Not from exertion, orcs of his stock didn't tire that easily, but from the same coiled tension that had every soldier in the city gripping their weapons a little too tightly. Perimeters holding. No hostile contact yet, but he stopped at the balcony rail and looked out past the walls, at red clay and scrub pine stretching to a horizon that had no business being there. Warchief, this isn't Kalimdor. This isn't anywhere. No, Sylvanas agreed. Her voice carried its usual double tone, the living register and the dead one layered beneath it, and if the strangeness of their situation troubled her, none of it reached her face. It isn't. Then where in the Titan's name are we? I don't know yet. She said it flatly, without the discomfort a mortal commander might have felt admitting ignorance. But I intend to find out before whoever built those walls. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, toward the far tree line, where a thin column of smoke had begun to rise from what might have been a village, or might have been an outpost, or might have been nothing at all. Finds out about us first. Grukthar followed her gaze. You think there's someone out there? I think, Sylvanas said, that a world doesn't build empty. Something farmed that scrubland. Something drove those roads. She could see them now, faint pale lines cutting across the clay in the middle distance, trade routes, worn by centuries of cartwheels and boots. This world has people in it, Grukthar. The only question is what kind, and how many, and whether they've already noticed us. As if in answer, far to the west, something in the sky flared gold and vanished. A flash too brief and too controlled to be natural weather, gone before the eye could properly register it. Sylvanas watched the space where the light had been for a long moment. They've noticed, she said. The flash Sylvanas had seen was Warren Rocco's signal flare, and Warren Rocco was, at that moment, regretting every decision that had put him 3 days east of Magnolia on a routine land survey job for the Magic Council's cartography division. He was not a combat mage. He was, by his own cheerful admission, a very good map maker who happened to know a few offensive spells in case of wolves, and he had been sent out to update the eastern border charts because nobody important wanted to spend a week camping in the Deadlands. He had been 3 miles from the hill when the sky tore. He had gotten one good look at the city. The walls, the size of it, the sheer wrongness of a metropolis where his last map showed nothing but scrub for 40 miles, before every instinct he had screamed at him to put distance between himself and it. He'd fired the flare on pure reflex, the standard notify council do not approach signal, and then he'd run for his chocobo and not looked back until he was 2 hours gone, and his hands had finally stopped shaking enough to write in his field journal. Structure, no. Settlement, no. City, appeared at Deadlands survey point, approx 6:15 a.m. Walls estimated 40+ feet. Extensive fortification. Unknown banner. Wolf skull. Crimson. Population unknown but substantial. Heard what I can only describe as war horns and mass movement within 15 minutes of appearance. No magic signature I recognize. Recommend immediate council response. Recommend, not recommend approach without significant force. I am not kidding. I have never seen anything like this, and I have surveyed 3 volcanoes. He reached the nearest way station by mid-afternoon and sent the fastest message lacrima pigeon he had, addressed directly to the Magic Council's regional office in Crocus, and then, because he was, whatever else he was, a professional, he sat down and started drawing what he remembered of the walls from memory, hands still not quite steady. The pigeon would reach Crocus by nightfall. The council's response would take another full day to organize, mired in the particular bureaucratic caution that governs any institution's first instinct toward the impossible. Confirm before we panic, and for the love of Onksurum, don't let this leak to the guilds before we understand what it is. That second part didn't work. Word doesn't travel through Fiore on official channels. It travels through taverns, through merchant caravans, through the dozens of small unlicensed mages who work the roads doing odd jobs and gossip in equal measure. By the time the sun set on the day Orgrimmar arrived, 3 separate rumors about a city that fell out of the sky in the Deadlands had already reached Magnolia, each more garbled than the last, and one of them, carried by a traveling merchant who'd heard it from a farmer, who'd heard it from someone who'd actually spoken to one of Warren Rocco's waystation contacts, reached the door of a guild hall, shaped like a squat, cheerful fortress, with a flag bearing a fairy's tale. A whole city. Lucy Hartfilia set her drink down harder than she meant to, and half of it sloshed onto the bar. Like, appeared? Just appeared? That's what the guy said. Wakaba Mine, who'd brought the rumor in along with a pouch of tobacco and an expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether to be entertained or worried, shrugged with the particular looseness of a man who liked being the center of attention, regardless of the news he carried. Out past the Deadlands, big walls, weird flag, and get this, nobody local, not a guild, not a kingdom nobody's heard of before. Just there, this morning, like it always had been, and somebody finally noticed. Across the bar, Mira Jane had gone very still in the way she did when something worried her enough to stop smiling, which, everyone at Fairy Tale knew, was worth paying attention to. Masters heard about this, she said quietly, more to herself than to the room, and turned toward the stairs up to Makarov's office, before anyone could ask her how she knew. She was right. Makarov Dreyar had, in fact, heard about it 40 minutes earlier, via a message crystal from an old council contact who trusted him enough to pass along things that weren't technically supposed to leave Crocus yet. The kind of professional courtesy built over decades of the council needing Fairy Tale's help, and Fairy Tale needing the council to occasionally look the other way. He was sitting behind his desk with the crystal still glowing faintly on the wood in front of him, and his usual jovial slouch had straightened into something sharper. Mira Jane didn't knock so much as announce her presence by opening the door. "Master, you've heard." "I've heard a rumor and a half," Makarov said. "The council's being cagey, which tells me even they don't fully understand what they're looking at yet. But the shape of it is real. Something the size of a city appeared 3 days east, sometime this morning, and whatever's inside those walls isn't sitting quietly." "Is it dangerous?" "I don't know." He said it the way he said most uncomfortable truths, plainly, without dressing it up. "That's rather the point, Mira. Nobody knows. A thing that size doesn't just arrive without either enormous power or enormous desperation behind it, and either one worries me." He drummed his fingers once against the desk, an old habit, and made a decision the way he usually did. Quickly, once he'd decided to make it at all. "I want eyes on it. Not a fight, not a rescue. Eyes. Someone who can look, report, and get out if it goes wrong." Mira Jane didn't need to ask who he meant. There was really only one team whose combination of curiosity and firepower made them the obvious, if occasionally regrettable, first choice for, "Go look at the terrifying unknown thing. Please don't start a war." "I'll get Natsu," she said, already turning for the door, and there was the faintest note of resignation in her voice, the specific tone of someone who had delivered this particular type of assignment to this particular team many, many times before, and knew exactly how "don't start a war" tended to go. Natsu Dragneel heard the words "mysterious city, nobody knows what's inside," and was on his feet before Mirajan finished the sentence. A city just showed up. His grin was already doing the thing it did before a fight. Wide, hungry, delighted by the universe's willingness to keep producing new things to hit. "That's awesome. When do we leave?" "Natsu, it's a reconnaissance mission," Mirajan said, in the tone of someone who had said this exact sentence to him roughly 400 times before, and expected it to work about as well as it always did. "Look, don't engage. Report back." Sure. He was already halfway to the door. "Lucy." "Gray, Erza, we got a job," Lucy groaned into her drink. "Why do I have a bad feeling about this?" "Because you always have a bad feeling," Gray said, not looking up from where he was. Already, somehow, shirtless despite it being mid-afternoon, and nobody having provoked him, checking the edge of one of his ice picks against his thumb. "And you're usually right." Erza Scarlet had said nothing yet, which in itself was a kind of statement. She'd re-equipped into traveling gear the moment the word mysterious reached her ears, and now she simply nodded once, the particular economical nod of someone who'd already decided the shape of the mission, before anyone finished explaining it. A city with unknown origins and unknown intentions, close enough to Magnolia to matter. "We should have left 5 minutes ago." "That's the spirit," Happy chimed in, buzzing up over Natsu's shoulder on blue wings, tail flicking with excitement. "Aye, sir." Makarov met them at the guild doors as they filed out, and for a moment his usual bluster fell away entirely, replaced by something older and more careful. "Listen to me," he said, and something in his voice made even Natsu slow down. "I mean this. You look. You do not provoke. You do not assume they're hostile, and you do not assume they're friendly either. Whatever built that place is not from around here, and not from around here has burned better mages than you before their first cup of tea." He held Erza's eyes in particular, the unspoken understanding between them that she'd be the one keeping the others in line. "If it looks like war, you come home and tell me. You do not start one on Fairy Tale's behalf. Understood?" "Understood," Erza said. "Good." Makarov's frown deepened, some old instinct working behind his eyes that he didn't share aloud. The particular unease of a man who'd survived enough impossible things to recognize when the world had just tilted a few degrees off its axis and hadn't finished settling. "Go carefully. Something tells me this isn't going to be a small thing." 3 days later he would be proven right in ways none of them could have imagined that afternoon. But for now, the team simply nodded, shouldered their gear, and set out east, toward a city that shouldn't exist, full of people who had no idea Fiore existed either, both of them about to discover that the world was considerably larger and stranger than either had ever prepared for. Behind them, Magnolia went on with its afternoon exactly as it always did. Merchants calling out prices, children chasing a stray cat through the square, the mundane hum of a world that had no idea, yet, how close the impossible had just landed. That would not last. The land changed the closer they got to the Deadlands, and it changed in ways none of them liked. It started subtly, the grass thinning, the soil turning a deeper red, the trees growing sparser and stranger, twisted in on themselves as if something in the air had spent the last day teaching them a different way to grow. By the second day of travel, Lucy noticed that her celestial spirit gate keys had gone faintly warm in their pouch, a low thrum she couldn't remember them ever producing before, as though whatever gates lay beyond them had caught wind of something on the other side of the world's fabric and were straining, gently, to investigate. "That's new," she muttered, pressing a palm against the pouch. What's new? Gray asked, not breaking stride. The keys. They're, I don't know. Buzzing. She frowned down at them. Loke's never done this before. None of them have. Erza, walking point with her usual unhurried purposefulness, glanced back. Magic responds to magic. If whatever's out there runs on something fundamentally different, it wouldn't surprise me if our own tools noticed before we did. Great, Gray said. Love that. Love when the world's like, pre-warning us. Natsu, for his part, had gone quiet in the specific way he did when he was hunting rather than wandering. Nose working, head tilted, the easy grin from Magnolia replaced by something more focused. Smells weird, he said, an hour before they crested the last ridge before the Deadlands proper. Weird how? Happy asked, riding on his shoulder. Like, Natsu struggled for the word. Like iron, and smoke, and something under that I don't have a name for. It's not Eternano smoke though, not like a forge or a spell. It's, he trailed off, shook his head. I don't know, it's not from here. That settled something uneasy into the group's collective stomach, and none of them spoke again until they reached the ridge. They stopped at the tree line the way soldiers stop at the edge of a battlefield they haven't chosen yet. Instinctively, all four of them, without a word, passed between them. Below, where 3 days ago there had been nothing but scrub and red clay for miles, there was a city. Even having been told, even having braced themselves the entire walk out, none of them were fully prepared for the scale of it. The walls alone dwarfed anything in Fiore that Erza could immediately compare it to, taller than Crocus's outer fortifications, built from some dark red stone that looked less quarried than grown, jagged spikes crowning every rampart like a row of broken teeth. Banners the color of dried blood snapped along the battlements, each stamped with a stylized wolf skull. Smoke rose from 100 points within the walls. Cookfires, forges, the ordinary business of a living city, and even at this distance they could hear it. War drums, still beating, a low, insistent rhythm that had apparently not stopped since the moment of arrival, and beneath that, half carried on the wind, something that might have been chanting, or might have been song, in a language none of them recognized. Okay, Gray said quietly. That's not a village. That's not a city, Lucy said, staring. That's practically a kingdom. Erza said nothing for a long moment, her Requip-trained eyes doing the automatic work of assessing walls, gate positions, visible watchtowers, the rough number of banners flying, the silent, professional math of what would it take to break this, and could we? The answer, forming somewhere behind her eyes, was not comforting. Whoever they are, she said finally, they didn't build that in a hurry. That's not an army's camp. That's generations of architecture. Whatever pulled that here, pulled an entire established nation with it. Natsu's grin had come back, but slower now, sharper at the edges. So it's not like a bunch of guys. No, Erza said. It is very much not a bunch of guys. They watched for another hour from the tree line, cataloging what they could. Figures moved along the walls, too far to make out details, but clearly armored, clearly numerous, clearly organized, patrols walking measured routes, rather than the chaotic milling of a panicked population. Twice, something flew, not a bird, too large and too deliberate in its flight path, gone before any of them could get a proper look. Once, from somewhere deep within the walls, a sound went up that made even Natsu's ears flatten instinctively. A roar, layered and enormous, that didn't belong to anything any of them had ever heard. Okay, Lucy said eventually, voice tight. I think we've seen enough? Like, mission accomplished. We saw the thing. It's big and scary. Let's go tell Master. We haven't actually confirmed anything, Erza said. We know it's large. We don't know what's inside it, who leads it, or whether it intends to stay. Master asked for eyes. We've barely used them. So what, we just walk up? Gray asked. No. Erza was already moving, angling along the ridgeline rather than down toward the walls directly. We find a vantage closer in, somewhere we can observe without being seen. If they've sent out patrols. She nodded to a faint dust trail moving along the base of the walls. Too regular to be random. We learn their routes before we decide anything else. It was, in retrospect, a reasonable plan, built on reasonable assumptions, and it fell apart within the hour. Because Orgrimmar's garrison, still on full alert after an arrival none of them understood, had scouts of their own combing the perimeter in exactly the kind of wide, thorough sweep that a team of 4 trying to stay hidden in unfamiliar terrain had very little chance of avoiding forever. Grukthar Bloodfist had drawn perimeter duty personally, not because a garrison officer of his rank needed to walk the line himself, but because sitting inside those walls doing nothing while the world outside them remained a complete mystery had made his skin crawl, and better to burn that energy on something useful than let it curdle into the kind of jumpy paranoia that got soldiers killed. He had 6 troopers with him, 2 orcs, a Tauren named Kelger who moved with the deceptive quiet of someone twice his mass shouldn't allow, a goblin sapper riding a mechanical construct that chittered and clicked as it scanned the terrain, and 2 trolls, one of whom, Zeltha Duskbrew, had insisted on tagging along, robes swapped for something more practical, her staff humming faintly as she ran detection spells every few hundred yards. "You're picking something up," Grukthar said. It wasn't a question. He'd worked with Zeltha long enough to read the particular stillness that came over her when a spell caught something interesting. "Movement," she said, eyes narrowed toward the tree line half a mile out. 4 signatures. Not animal. Too structured. Too deliberate. And, she frowned, adjusting something in the spell's weave. Magic. Strong magic. Not our kind. It reads wrong, like everything else in this place, but it's definitely there, concentrated in one of the 4. Grukthar's grip tightened on his axe. "Armed? Can't tell that from a location ping, Grukthar." But she said it without heat. She was already moving, staff lowering into a ready stance. "I can tell you they're not hiding well. Whoever they are, they're not professional infiltrators. Small mercies." He raised a fist, the old silent signal, and his troopers fanned out without a word. Kelger circling wide to cut off retreat, the goblin's construct scuttling ahead low to the ground, the 2 orcs falling in at Grukthar's flanks. "We don't know who these people are. We don't know if they're the ones who did this to us, scouts for something worse, or just locals who got unlucky enough to live near where we landed. Nobody swings first unless swung at. Understood?" A ripple of grunted acknowledgement. They moved. Erza felt it before she saw it. The particular prickle of being watched, honed over years of dangerous work, and she stopped mid-stride with a hand raised, the other 3 freezing instantly behind her. "We're made," she said quietly. "What? How?" Lucy started, and then didn't need to finish, because the tree line around them was suddenly, unmistakably, not empty. They came from 3 directions at once, and even braced as the team was for something strange, the reality of it hit like cold water. Not human, not entirely. A pair of towering green-skinned warriors in spiked red and black armor, tusks jutting from their lower jaws, weapons already in hand but not yet raised. A massive horned figure that walked on 2 legs like a man, but had the head and build of something between a bull and a bear, silent and enormous, cutting off the path behind them. A smaller, wiry green creature riding some kind of clicking, whirring metal construct that looked disturbingly purposeful, all exposed gears and glowing lenses. And at the center of the formation, flanked by 2 more of the tusked green warriors, a golden-skinned woman with pointed ears and eyes that glowed a faint, unnatural green, a runed staff held ready but not aimed. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Both groups simply stared, sizing each other up with the specific, wary stillness of professionals who understood exactly how quickly this could go wrong. Natsu broke it first, because Natsu broke most silences first. "Whoa," he said, delighted despite himself, fire already curling faintly around his knuckles on pure reflex. "Okay, you guys are not from around here. Neither apparently are you," the golden-skinned woman said. Zeltha, though the team had no way of knowing that yet, in common, that carried a strange lilting accent, each word careful, as though she were listening to her own translation spellwork in real time, and wasn't fully confident in it yet. Her eyes flicked over each of them in turn, cataloging. "You're not soldiers, not dressed like any army I've seen." And that, her gaze settled on the faint pink glow of the guild mark on the back of Lucy's hand, half hidden by her sleeve. "That mark, what is it?" "Guild mark," Lucy said automatically, then immediately regretted volunteering information to a woman flanked by armed orcs the size of small buildings. We're mages, from fairy tale. We're not here to fight anyone." "Mages," Zeltha repeated, and something in her expression sharpened with interest despite the tension. "You channel arcane the way we do?" "I don't know what arcane means to you," Erza said, stepping forward, deliberately putting herself a half-pace ahead of the others, weight balanced, hand resting near, but not on, the hilt of a blade at her hip. Her voice was calm, level, the voice of someone who had diffused 100 volatile standoffs and understood the value of being the first to sound reasonable. "We use Eternino, magic drawn from the world around us, channeled through our bodies. We came here to observe your city, not to threaten it. Fairy tale sent us." "Fairy tale," Grukthar repeated, testing the words like he didn't trust the taste of them. Axe still low but ready. His eyes moved over Natsu's exposed forearms, the faint heat shimmer rising off his skin, the wary stillness of Gray's stance, the way Erza held herself like a soldier despite the ordinary traveling clothes. "A guild. Not a nation. Not a nation," Erza confirmed. "A guild of mages who take on jobs, protecting people, solving problems too dangerous for ordinary folk to handle. We're not a government. We don't speak for one." She let that sit a moment, watching it land, watching Grukthar's shoulders shift fractionally as he recalculated something. "You're not from Fiore. That much is obvious. So I'll ask honestly, where are you from, and what happened to bring an entire city here?" It was Grukthar's turn to hesitate, weighing how much to give a stranger armed with fire and unknown power standing in the middle of contested ground. But something about the woman's directness, the fact that she'd offered information first, unprompted, rather than demanding it, seemed to tip some internal scale. "Orgrimmar," he said finally, "capital of the Horde. We come from a world called Azeroth. Yesterday morning we were exactly where we've always been. Then the sky tore, and now we're," he gestured, a short frustrated motion, at the unfamiliar trees, the wrong-colored sky, the whole absurd fact of their situation, here, wherever here is. "Fiore," Lucy offered, cautiously. "This is the kingdom of Fiore." "Never heard of it," Grukthar said flatly. "We'd never heard of Azeroth either, 20 minutes ago," Gray pointed out, not unreasonably. "Guessing that makes us even." A short, tense silence. Then, unexpectedly, one of the other orcs, younger, standing at Grukthar's flank, let out a short, barking laugh, quickly stifled under a glare from his commander. But something in the room's temperature had shifted, just slightly, the particular easing that happens when two groups of dangerous strangers realize the other side is at least willing to talk instead of swing first. Zeltha's staff had lowered, fractionally, though her eyes hadn't stopped their careful cataloging. "You said Eternanon, a world ambient energy source." Her interest was plainly, professionally genuine now, the wariness of a soldier giving way to the hunger of a scholar, handed an entirely new field of study. We channel arcane, drawn from the great dark beyond, from ley energy, from a dozen different founts depending on the discipline. If your magic runs on something structurally different from ours, that has implications I very much want to understand. She caught herself, glanced at Grukthar, visibly reining the enthusiasm back in. Later, assuming later happens. It'll happen, Erza said, if nobody here does anything stupid in the next 5 minutes. Agreed, Grukthar said, with the particular grimness of a man who'd clearly already decided several things, and didn't love any of them. Here is what I can offer. I don't have authority to invite you into Orgrimmar. That decision sits above me, but I can escort you to the perimeter, under guard, and send word ahead that 4 mages from a local guild wish to speak. Whether the war chief grants an audience is not mine to promise. War chief, Erza repeated. Your ruler, my ruler, Grukthar confirmed, in a tone that made clear exactly how much debate he expected to entertain on the subject. Sylvanas Windrunner. She'll want to know about you regardless. Better she hears it from a controlled meeting than from more scouts stumbling over each other in these woods. His eyes moved over Natsu again, the fire still flickering faintly at his knuckles, unextinguished but not aimed. Your fire user. He's not planning to use that on my patrol, I take it. Nah, Natsu said, grinning, and let the flame die out entirely. An easy gesture of good faith that visibly cost him nothing. You guys didn't swing first. I don't swing first either. Usually, Lucy muttered under her breath, in the exact tone of someone who had personally witnessed several exceptions to that rule. Grukthar studied Natsu a moment longer, the casual dismissal of the flame, the loose, confident stance of someone who very clearly did not consider himself the underdog in this clearing despite being outnumbered, and something behind the orc's eyes recalibrated again, filing the fire mage under a different, more careful category. Fine, he said. Weapons down, all of you. Not sheathed, I understand mages don't work that way, just lowered. We walk to the wall together. No sudden magic, no sudden movement, and will extend the same courtesy. He glanced at Zeltha, who nodded, murmuring something under her breath that dismissed her detection spell with a small flare of green light. Sound fair? Erza looked to her team, Natsu practically vibrating with barely restrained excitement at the idea of seeing inside the walls, Gray's wary nod, Lucy's still nervous but resolved expression, and turned back to Grukthar with the calm authority of someone used to making exactly this kind of call. Fair, she said. Lead the way. The walk to Orgrimmar's outer wall took the better part of an hour, and it was, without question, one of the strangest hours any of the 4 fairy tale mages had ever experienced. Walking in loose formation, alongside soldiers from an entirely different world, trading careful, cautious small talk that kept dissolving into bursts of genuine curiosity on both sides. Happy, who had been very quietly hiding in Natsu's scarf through the entire standoff, finally worked up the courage to poke his head out somewhere around the halfway mark, and the resulting reaction, Kelgur the Tauren stopping dead in his tracks to stare, and then, after a long moment of visible internal deliberation, asking with enormous seriousness whether the cat could talk, broke what remained of the tension better than anything either side's diplomacy had managed. Course I can talk, Happy said, affronted. I can fly too. Kelgur looked at Grukthar. Grukthar looked, briefly, like a man questioning several of his life choices. Interesting world, was all he said. By the time the walls of Orgrimmar rose up in front of them, close now, close enough to see the individual courses of red stone, the arrow slits, the orcish sentries along the battlements who'd gone very still and very alert at the sight of strangers approaching with their patrol. Lucy had learned that Eternano meant absolutely nothing to Zeltha's people, and that arcane meant absolutely nothing to hers, and both of them had spent the last 20 minutes trying, with mounting mutual fascination, to describe their respective magic systems to each other in terms the other could understand. Gray had gotten into a surprisingly detailed conversation with one of the younger orc troopers about ice. Apparently, Azeroth had its own frost-wielding traditions, though the trooper's descriptions of shaman magic and elemental spirits sounded stranger and more animistic than anything Gray was used to. And Natsu had simply been Natsu, peppering Grukthar with an endless stream of questions about the roar they'd heard earlier. Was that a dragon? Do you guys have dragons? Can I fight it? That Grukthar answered with the patient, faintly exhausted tone of a man dealing with an overexcited child, right up until the word dragon got a genuinely surprised look out of him. You have dragons here, Grukthar said slowly. In this world. Had, Natsu said, a flicker of old grief crossing his face before he covered it with his usual grin. Long story. We have dragons too, Grukthar said, and something about the way he said it, careful, almost reluctant, suggested that particular topic came with its own long, complicated history he wasn't about to unpack for a stranger in the middle of a first contact walk. They reached the gates as the sun began its slow slide toward the horizon, and the massive wooden and iron doors, easily 40 feet tall, banded with dark metal, carved with the same wolf skull sigil that flew from every banner, groaned open just wide enough to admit the party. Beyond them, Orgrimmar unfolded in full, the roar of a city very much alive, forges ringing, market cries in half a dozen unfamiliar languages, orcish children chasing each other between market stalls with the same unself-conscious joy of children anywhere, and above it all, at the city's heart, a massive fortified structure of dark wood and darker stone that could only be the seat of power itself. Erza took it all in with the same steady, assessing calm she'd carried since the tree line, filing away every detail, the fortifications, the numbers, the sheer scale of a civilization that had crossed into their world fully intact and clearly capable of defending itself. Beside her, Lucy had gone quiet with something closer to awe than fear. Gray had, for once, remembered to keep his shirt on, and Natsu was grinning at all of it like Christmas had come early, already half convinced this was going to be the best mission Fairy Tale had ever taken. Word will already be moving ahead of us, Zeltha said, falling into step beside Erza as they passed through the gates, the massive doors groaning shut behind them with a finality that made Lucy's stomach twist just slightly. The war chief will know you're here before we're halfway to the hold. I'd recommend, she hesitated, choosing her words with obvious care. Recommend you let her ask the first questions. She does not appreciate being managed. Understood, Erza said. I hope it is, Zeltha said, quiet enough that only Erza caught it, and there was something in her tone, not quite a warning, but close to it, that settled a fresh weight into the pit of Erza's stomach as they walked deeper into a city built by a war none of them had fought, toward a ruler none of them had met, carrying the entire unspoken weight of two worlds' first real conversation on their shoulders. Behind them, the gates of Orgrimmar closed fully, and Fiore's first true ambassadors to the Horde walked forward into whatever came next. Grommash Hold had not been built for comfort, and it showed no interest in offering any now. The great hall rose in tiers of dark timber and blood-red stone, war trophies mounted along its walls, tusks, banners, the skulls of beasts none of the fairy tale mages could begin to name, and firelight from braziers set at intervals, threw long, restless shadows across a floor worn smooth by centuries of boots. It was a room built to remind everyone who entered it that the Horde had not survived this long by being gentle, and every one of the four visitors felt that message land the moment Grukthar led them through its doors. At the far end, on a throne that looked less like a seat of ceremony than a war council chair that happened to sit higher than the rest, Sylvanas Windrunner waited. She did not rise when they entered, She did not need to. There was a stillness to her that unsettled Lucy in a way she couldn't immediately name. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of something that had simply stopped needing to perform the small, restless motions of the living. Pale, gaunt, beautiful in a way that felt carved rather than born. Her eyes glowed a faint, banked red in the firelight, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried in it a second voice beneath the first, hollow, layered, unmistakably other. Her gaze moved over each of them in turn, unhurried, cataloging the way Zeltha had in the woods but with none of the scholar's warmth behind it. This was a queen's assessment, cold and complete. 4 mages, walking uninvited toward my walls, from a kingdom my scouts had never heard of an hour before they met you. Her eyes settled on Erza last, and stayed there. You'll forgive me if I don't open with hospitality. We didn't expect any, Erza said, matching the queen's stillness with her own. Spine straight, voice level. We came to observe, not to intrude. My guildmaster sent us to learn what we could about a city that appeared in our territory without warning. I understand that concerns you. It concerns us as well. Your territory, Sylvanas repeated, something faintly, dangerously amused moving behind the words. An interesting claim, from someone standing in a kingdom my army has never set foot in before yesterday. Tell me, Erza, does your territory extend everywhere your guild happens to feel curious? No, Erza said, without flinching. It extends to the safety of the people who live near where you landed. That's all. We're not here to lay claim to anything. We're here because an unexplained city with visible military strength appeared 3 days from a town of 30,000 people, and someone needed to find out whether that city intended harm before it became a crisis instead of a conversation. A long silence followed, filled only by the crackle of the braziers. Sylvanas studied Erza with an intensity that made Gray's jaw tighten and set Natsu's easy grin into something more watchful, though neither of them spoke. An honest answer, Sylvanas said finally. I'll offer one in return, since apparently that's the game tonight. She rose, at last, descending from the dais with an unhurried, gliding grace that made no sound at all against the stone floor. We did not choose to come here. My people were fighting a war on our own world, a war we had just finished winning, at considerable cost, when something reached through a wound the fighting left behind and dragged an entire city sideways into a place none of us had ever heard of. We do not know how it happened. We do not know if it can be undone, and until I understand this world well enough to know whether it intends to be an ally, a battlefield, or a grave, I intend to treat every stranger who approaches my walls with exactly the caution that uncertainty demands. Her red eyes glinted, cold and precise. You'll understand if that includes you. That's fair, Natsu said, before anyone could stop him, and several sets of eyes, Erza's, Zeltha's, even Grukthar's from his position by the door, swung toward him with varying degrees of alarm. He didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. I mean, if somebody yanked my guild hall into some random world I never heard of, I'd probably be pretty jumpy too. Doesn't mean we gotta fight about it though. Sylvanas turned the full weight of her attention onto him, and for a moment, the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. And what would you do instead, Fire Mage? Figure out what's actually going on, Natsu said, shrugging, apparently either immune to or simply uninterested in the danger radiating off the woman in front of him. Seems like neither of us knows anything about the other, and that's usually how fights start over nothing. So, what if we just, talked first? Worked out whether we've actually got a problem before deciding we do? It was, Erza reflected privately, the single most diplomatically useful thing Natsu Dragneel had said in the entire time she'd known him, and it had come out of him with all the calculated tact of a boulder rolling downhill. Something flickered across Sylvanas's expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, gone as quickly as it appeared. Refreshingly direct, she said. Very well, let's talk then, and see whether talking is enough. She gestured, and the guards along the walls eased back a fraction, though none of them fully relaxed. Tell me about this world. Fiore, was it? Who governs it? What powers exist within it that I should be aware of before my people finish deciding whether to fear it? Erza glanced at the others once, a silent check, and began. She laid it out with the careful economy of someone used to briefing dangerous strangers. The kingdom of Fiore, its monarchy largely ceremonial in matters of magic, the magic council that actually regulated magical affairs across the continent, the patchwork of legal guilds that handled everything from odd jobs to genuine threats, the rarer and more dangerous dark guilds that operated outside any law at all. She spoke of Eternano, the ambient magical energy that saturated the world and could be drawn on by anyone with the training to do it. Of Zareth and the old wars fought over immortality and curses centuries past. Of ethereal demons and the scars they'd left. Of dragons, both the ancient kind that had shaped the world's history, and the handful of dragon slayers, Natsu among them, who'd been raised by one. Sylvanas listened without interrupting, her expression giving away nothing, though Zeltha, standing quietly at the edge of the hall, listening with the barely restrained hunger of a scholar handed a syllabus for an entirely new field, was visibly cataloging every detail for later. A council that regulates magic but does not command armies, Sylvanas said when Erza finished. Guilds that function as both mercenary companies and social institutions. A kingdom that apparently tolerates dozens of small, semi-independent armed factions operating within its borders, without dissolving into civil war. Her tone made it clear exactly how unusual she found this arrangement. Your world runs on a great deal of trust for people who apparently fight demons for a living. It runs on people mostly wanting the same things, Erza said. Safety, purpose, somewhere to belong. The guilds provide that as much as they provide combat strength. Fairy Tale isn't an army. It's a family that happens to be dangerous when it needs to be. Something in Sylvanas's expression shifted at that. Not warmth exactly, but a flicker of something more considering. A family, she repeated, quiet enough that it might have been meant only for herself. How novel. Your turn, Gray said, arms crossed, breaking the moment before it could linger into something more private than any of them had intended. You said war, legion. What's that mean? What are you people actually? Because no offense, but you're not exactly, he gestured, vaguely, at the assembled orcs, trolls, and the pale, unnervingly still queen in front of them. Standard. Sylvanas's mouth curved, faintly, at the bluntness of it. No, she agreed. We are not standard, by your world's measure, or ours. She returned to her throne, though this time she sat facing them rather than looming above, an economy of body language that Erza noted and filed away as a deliberate, calculated softening. The Horde is an alliance of races bound by history and necessity. Orcs, once enslaved to a demonic pact that nearly destroyed them, now free and rebuilding. Trolls, older than most nations on our world, keepers of Loa magic and old grudges. Tauren, plainsfolk who worship ancestors and earth. Blood elves, she gestured at herself. At Zeltha, a small economical motion. My people, addicted for a long, painful history to a magic called arcane, though we've made our peace with that hunger since. Forsaken. And here, for the first time, something colder entered her voice, an old wound surfacing briefly before she buried it again. The dead who refused to stay that way. I lead them all. And until 3 days ago, we had just finished a war against an invasion force from beyond the stars themselves. Demons who wanted to burn our entire world down to feed something they called the Legion. We won. It cost us more than I'm inclined to discuss with strangers on a first meeting, And then the world thought it appropriate to reward that victory by tearing my capital out of it entirely. The hall went quiet at that, the weight of it settling over even Natsu's restless energy for a moment. "That's rough," he said finally, with the particular blunt sincerity that made his diplomacy so unpredictable, and somehow, occasionally effective anyway. "Winning a war, and then getting yanked somewhere random right after. That's rough." "It is," Sylvanas said, and did not elaborate further. Lucy, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, found her voice at last. "What happens now? I mean, if you don't know how you got here, and you don't know if you can go back, then we adapt," Sylvanas said, simply, with the flat finality of someone who had adapted to worse things than an unexpected relocation. "We always have. My people did not survive plague and betrayal and demonic invasion by waiting patiently for the world to fix itself." Her red eyes swept the hall once more, taking in her own soldiers, her own walls, the strange assembly of foreign mages standing in the middle of it all. "Orgrimmar will remain. We will learn this world's rules, its dangers, its politics, and we will decide, in time, whether it holds anything worth allying with, or whether it's simply one more battlefield we didn't ask for." "And if it's the second one?" Erza asked, quiet but unflinching. Sylvanas met her gaze directly, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. "Then I hope, for both our sakes, that your guild is as capable as your fire mage's confidence suggests." A pause, considering. "But I am not eager for that outcome. A war on unfamiliar ground, against a world I don't yet understand, serves no one, least of all a people who only just finished bleeding for a war they didn't choose either. I would prefer, Erza of Fairy Tale, that this be the last confrontation either of our peoples has to prepare for today." "So would I," Erza said. Something passed between them then. Not trust, not yet, but the mutual recognition of two commanders who understood exactly what was at stake, and exactly how quickly misunderstanding could curdle into catastrophe. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't even alliance. But it was, perhaps, a foundation something could eventually be built on. "I'll make you an offer," Sylvanas said, rising again, the audience visibly drawing toward its close. "Return to your guild. Tell your master what you've seen and heard here. I will do the same with my own council. Let both our peoples take the time to think rather than react. If your council, or your kingdom, or whoever governs such things in Fiore, wishes to open a more formal dialogue, I will receive an envoy, properly this time, not 4 mages who happen to wander close enough for my scouts to find." "That seems fair," Erza said. "It is fair," Sylvanas said, and there was something almost dry in the way she said it. "I am rarely accused of excessive generosity, Erza. Don't mistake this for softness. I simply prefer wars I choose to wars that choose me, and right now, this one hasn't decided which it wants to be yet." She gestured, and Grukthar straightened from his position by the door. "Escort them back to the gate, unharmed, unhindered. And Grukthar, make sure the perimeter units know. Mages of this fairy tale guild are not to be treated as hostile on sight, going forward. Not until they give us reason." "Understood, Warchief." As the 4 mages turned to go, Sylvanas's voice caught them one more time, quiet and precise. "One more thing." Erza turned back. "Your dragons, the ones you mentioned, the ones who raised your fire mage." Her red eyes held a flicker of genuine, careful interest, the first unguarded thing she'd shown all evening. "We have dragons of our own, in Azeroth. Ancient ones, some kind, some monstrous, most somewhere between. I would be curious, in time, to know whether yours and ours share any kinship at all, or whether the word simply means something different, on either side of whatever tore us into your world." A pause, purely academic interest, for now. "I'll ask him," Erza said, glancing at Natsu, who had gone oddly quiet at the mention, old grief flickering behind his eyes again before he pushed it down. "Do," Sylvanas said, and with that, the audience ended, the great doors of Grommash Hold swinging open to release them back into the fading orange light of Orgrimmar's first full day in a world it had never asked to join. They walked back through the city in a different kind of silence than they'd arrived in, not the wary tension of strangers assessing a threat, but the heavier, more thoughtful quiet of people who'd just glimpsed the true scale of what had landed in their world. "So," Gray said finally, once the walls were behind them and the tree line ahead, "that could have gone worse. Could have gone a lot worse," Lucy agreed, letting out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for the better part of an hour. I don't even know how to describe her. She's terrifying, like genuinely, properly terrifying, in a way I don't think I've felt from anyone since," she trailed off, unable to immediately think of an equivalent. "Since ever," Happy offered helpfully, from his perch on Natsu's shoulder. "Since ever," Lucy agreed. Erza said nothing for a long moment, still turning the audience over in her mind. The careful, calculated way Sylvanas had revealed just enough to seem forthcoming, while giving away nothing that might be used against her. The flicker of something almost like weariness beneath the Queen's icy composure. The genuine uncertainty in her voice, when she'd admitted she didn't know if her people could ever go home. It painted a picture more complicated than threat or ally, and Erza had learned, over years of dangerous work, to distrust any assessment that resolved that quickly. "She's not our enemy," Erza said finally. "Not yet, and I don't think she wants to be. But she's not our friend either, and I don't think she'll ever pretend to be one for convenience's sake. She's exactly what she looks like, a queen who's already survived worse than us, sizing up whether we're going to be a problem." She glanced back once, at the walls receding behind them, banners still snapping in the evening wind. "Master needs to hear all of this, every word of it, because I don't think this is a situation the council can just observe from a distance and hope it settles on its own." Natsu, who had been unusually quiet since the mention of dragons, finally spoke. "You think there's actually dragons over there? Like real ones? Ones that might know Igneal, or anything about where he came from?" "I don't know," Erza said honestly, "but I think, eventually, we're going to find out." Behind them, the sun finished setting over Orgrimmar's new horizon, and within the walls, Sylvanas Windrunner stood once more on her balcony, watching 4 foreign mages disappear into the tree line, already turning over in her mind the dozen calculations a queen makes when a new world has just handed her an entirely unfamiliar set of pieces to play. The first day was over. Neither side yet knew whether the ones that followed would bring peace, war, or the long, uneasy gray between them. But for the first time since the sky had torn open over the Deadlands, both sides understood, at least, that they were not facing the unknown alone. The Magic Council's regional chamber in Crocus was not built for panic, but by the second day after Warren Rocco's flare, panic was doing a very good impression of the room's ordinary business anyway. Orgrimmar sat at the head of the long marble table with his hands folded in front of him, which was, for those who knew him, always a bad sign. The more agitated Ivan actually felt, the more deliberately still he made himself look. Around him, 11 other council members argued in overlapping voices, a mess of raised concerns that hadn't yet organized itself into anything like a plan. A city, Ivan. An entire city. And Fairy Tale sent an unsanctioned team out to make contact before we'd even confirmed the reports. With respect, if we'd waited for confirmation through official channels, we'd still be waiting. Fairy Tale acted faster than we did, which is precisely the problem. The problem is that 4 guild mages just conducted the kingdom's first diplomatic contact with an entirely unknown power, without authorization, without a translator vetted by this council, without so much as a formal briefing on what to say or not say. They're back. They're unharmed. I'd call that a considerably better outcome than the alternative, which was a council survey team wandering into those walls with no combat capability whatsoever. Ivan let it run another 30 seconds before raising one hand, and the chamber quieted with the particular speed of a room that had learned, over years, that his patience had limits worth respecting. Enough. He looked to the far end of the table, where Makarov Dreyar sat with his usual deceptively mild expression, having been summoned that morning to explain himself in person. Master Dreyar, you sent Erza Scarlet's team into contact with an unknown foreign power, without council authorization. I'd like to hear why, before this chamber decides how displeased to be about it. Because Warren Rocco's flare reached Magnolia by rumor, a full day before your office managed to send me an official notice, Makarov said, unbothered, folding his hands over his stomach. By the time your council finished debating whether to debate the matter, half of Eastern Fiore already knew a city had appeared in the Deadlands. I judged, correctly I believe, that having eyes on the ground with the good sense not to start a war was considerably safer than leaving that vacuum for someone with less restraint to fill. A faint, pointed pause. Or for it to fill itself, the way rumors tend to, with panic. Several council members exchanged looks that suggested they didn't love the implication, mostly because it was accurate. And what did your team learn? Ivan asked. Makarov's expression sobered, the faint needling humor falling away. More than I expected, and rather less than I'd like. He related plainly, the scale of the city, the multiple unfamiliar races involved, the queen who called herself war chief and ruled with a control that Erza's report described as absolute but not unreasonable, the admission that the city's arrival had been as unwilled and unexplained on their end as it was on Fiore's. They are not conquerors who arrived intending invasion. That much I believe. But they are also not refugees who'll simply assimilate quietly into a corner of the map and cause no further concern. This war chief made it plain. They intend to stay, to learn our world's rules, and to decide for themselves, on their own timeline, whether Fiore is worth allying with, or simply another battlefield they didn't choose. A queen making unilateral decisions about a kingdom she has no claim to. One council member, Org, broad and blunt-spoken, said, with obvious distaste. That's not diplomacy, Makarov. That's occupation with better manners. It's caution, Makarov corrected, mild but firm. Put yourself in her position. An entire city, full of people who trusted her to keep them alive through a war they'd only just survived, dropped without warning into a world she knows nothing about. Would you extend trust freely in her place? Or would you also want to understand exactly what you'd landed in before deciding who to hand your people's safety over to? That landed with more weight than Org seemed to want to admit, and he subsided, if grudgingly. The question before this council, Ivan said, cutting through before the argument could reopen, isn't whether her caution is reasonable. It's what Fiore does next. We have a foreign power, militarily capable, apparently significant in scale. With magic our detection methods don't fully register. Sitting 3 days from Magnolia, and no established diplomatic framework for dealing with a situation like this, because nothing like this has ever happened. He looked around the table, letting that settle. I want options, not reactions. Options. The chamber, for once, took the instructions seriously, and the discussion that followed, heated, occasionally sharp, but finally productive, settled by evening into 3 parallel tracks the council would pursue simultaneously. First, a formal diplomatic delegation, properly credentialed this time, would be sent to Orgrimmar to establish an official channel of communication, the envoy Sylvanas herself had requested. Second, the Council's research division would begin a discreet, careful study of the differences between Eternano-based magic and whatever this arcane energy was that the newcomers channeled, both for scholarly and, several council members admitted more quietly, strategic reasons. And third, most contentiously, a quiet advisory would go out to the kingdom's legal guilds, not an order. The council had no authority to command guilds directly, but a strong recommendation to avoid provoking incidents near the new city until the situation stabilized. That last one won't hold, Makarov said when the meeting adjourned, and Ivan walked with him briefly toward the chamber doors, the two of them alone in the corridor for the first time all day. You don't think your own guild will listen? Fairy Tale will listen fine, Makarov said. It's the others I'd worry about. Half of Fiore's guilds are going to hear unclaimed foreign power, unknown capabilities, possibly hostile, and think opportunity before they think caution. Mercenary guilds smell profit in chaos, the way sharks smell blood. And there's at least one segment of Fiore's population who won't wait for the council's blessing before deciding how to react to something they don't understand. His expression darkened slightly. Fear moves faster than policy, Ivan. It always has. Ivan said nothing to that, because there was nothing reassuring to say, and both of them knew it. He was, in the specific and unfortunate way of these things, correct within 3 days. Phantom Lord had never needed the Magic Council's blessing to act on an opportunity, and Jose Porla, reinstated, rebuilt, operating with considerably more caution since his last public humiliation at Fairy Tale's hands, but no less ambitious for it, heard about Orgrimmar through the same rumor networks everyone else had, and arrived at a very different set of conclusions than Makarov Dreyar had. An entire city, dropped into Fiore with no established ties to any guild, any kingdom, any prior claim, whatever power that city held, and the reports suggested considerable power, represented, in Jose's calculating estimation, either an extraordinary threat or an extraordinary asset, and Phantom Lord had built its recent recovery on precisely the kind of careful, deniable maneuvering that let it pursue the second possibility, while publicly denying any interest in the first. He didn't send an army. That would have been foolish, and Jose Porla, whatever else could be said of him, was rarely foolish twice in the same fashion. Instead, he sent something quieter, a small team of his most discreet operatives, tasked not with contact, but with observation. Watch the city's patrols, map its defenses from a careful distance. Identify, if possible, any internal divisions within this horde that might, eventually, be worth exploiting. It was a modest first move, cautious by Phantom Lord's usual standards, and it should have been safe. It was not. Orgrimmar's perimeter, in the days following the Fairy Tale team's visit, had not relaxed. If anything, Sylvanas had tightened it. The audience with the strange fire-scarfed mage and his companions had bought a measure of goodwill toward Fairy Tale specifically, but it had done nothing to lower her guard against everyone else, and her scouts and shaman had spent the intervening days laying a far more thorough web of magical detection around the city's approaches than the crude visual patrols Grukthar's team had relied on during first contact. Phantom Lord's observation team made it within 2 miles of the walls before Zeltha Duskbrew's expanded ward network flagged their presence, and Grukthar, given standing orders this time, rather than improvising in the field, moved to intercept with considerably less patience than he'd extended to Erza's team. There was no fight. Phantom Lord's operatives were skilled infiltrators, not combat specialists, and the moment they found themselves surrounded by armored orcish soldiers with clearly hostile intent, they surrendered rather than test whether their magic could outrun an axe. But the incident reached Sylvanas's ears within the hour, and her reaction, relayed back through the council's newly appointed envoy days later, was unambiguous. "Tell your council," she said, cold and precise, to the nervous young diplomat sent to formally apologize on the kingdom's behalf, that I extended goodwill to the first guild that approached me honestly. I do not extend the same courtesy to guilds who send spies instead of envoys. If this phantom lord wishes to test my patience further, I will not trouble your council with the outcome. I will simply handle it." The message reached Crocus within the day, and reached Jose Porla shortly after, delivered, with a particular, pointed satisfaction, by a council liaison who made no effort to hide how thoroughly Phantom Lord's overreach had embarrassed the kingdom's careful diplomatic effort. Jose, for his part, absorbed the rebuke with the outward calm of a man used to strategic setbacks, and gave no public indication of what he intended next. Privately, he filed the incident away, not as a lesson to abandon his interest in Orgrimmar's power, but as confirmation that whatever the newcomers commanded, it was worth acquiring by means considerably more patient than a scouting team. Not every reaction to Orgrimmar's arrival came wrapped in a guild's calculated ambition. Some of it came, more simply and more dangerously, from fear. In the weeks that followed, as word of the monster city spread through Fiore's smaller towns in increasingly distorted forms, a city of demons, some said. An army preparing to conquer the kingdom, said others, the rumors growing wilder with each retelling. A handful of frightened ordinary people did what frightened ordinary people have always done when a threat feels too large to reason with and too close to ignore. A small mob, no more than 20 strong, armed with farm tools and the particular courage that comes from having convinced each other collectively that action was better than waiting, marched 3 days east from a border village toward the Deadlands, intending, in the vague, unformed way that mobs intend things, to see the threat off before it could threaten their homes. They got within sight of the walls before an Orgrimmar patrol found them, and the encounter could have gone catastrophically, tragically wrong in a dozen different ways. It didn't, mostly because Grukthar Bloodfist, who happened to be leading that day's perimeter sweep, took one look at the mismatched collection of pitchforks, kitchen knives, and genuinely terrified faces in front of him, and recognized, with the weary clarity of a soldier who'd seen every version of this exact scene before on his own world, that he was looking at frightened farmers rather than an armed threat. "Go home," he told them flatly, weapon lowered but voice carrying enough authority that none of them argued. "You're not soldiers. You're not going to accomplish anything here, except getting yourselves killed by someone with less patience than me. Go home, tell your neighbors there's nothing to fight, and let the people whose job this actually is handle it." They went. Shaken, humiliated, but alive, and the story that reached Fiore in the following days carried this time more accurately, because Grukthar himself had insisted on escorting them partway back, and made sure the tale traveled with the true ending, rather than a more dramatic invented one. Did something unexpected. It softened, just slightly, the wilder edges of the fear that had been building. They didn't attack. They could have. They let them go. It wasn't trust. It was nowhere close to trust. But it was, Makarov reflected when the report reached him, the first small crack of something other than pure dread forming in how ordinary Fiore was beginning to understand its new neighbor. And in a situation this volatile, he'd learned long ago, small cracks were often where the more durable things eventually grew. Back in Orgrimmar, Sylvanas received the report of the mob's approach with considerably less philosophical patience than Grukthar had shown in the field. "Farmers," she repeated, when Grukthar delivered his account in Grommash Hold that evening. 20 untrained farmers with kitchen knives marched 3 days to attack my walls. They didn't attack, War Chief. They stood at the tree line and looked terrified until I told them to leave. That's not the part that concerns me." She rose from her throne, pacing with the restless, controlled energy of someone working through a problem that had nothing to do with the immediate incident and everything to do with what it revealed. "It means fear is already ahead of understanding in this kingdom. It means the story of what we are is outrunning the truth of it, and stories, once they take root, are considerably harder to uproot than an actual army. She stopped, looking toward the window, toward the lights of her own city settling into another uneasy night in an unfamiliar world. We handled it well enough this time. It won't stay this simple. What would you have us do differently? Grukthar asked. Nothing, for now, Sylvanas said. You showed restraint. That was correct. But it tells me the envoy exchange with their council needs to move faster than it has been. And it tells me... She paused, something calculating settling behind her red eyes. It tells me that guild, Fairy Tale, the ones who came honestly, who didn't need a formal council delegation to know better than to provoke us. I want more contact with them, not less. If this world is going to learn what we actually are before its fear does the job of teaching them something worse, I'd rather it learn it from people who've already shown some capacity for good sense. You want to open a relationship with a guild, not the kingdom itself. I want to open a relationship with whoever in this world actually demonstrates the judgment to be worth one, Sylvanas said. So far, that's been exactly 4 mages and a talking cat, Grukthar. The kingdom's formal channels can catch up when they're ready. I'm not in the habit of waiting for bureaucracies to feel comfortable before I act in my people's interest. Grukthar, who had served under enough commanders to recognize when a decision had already been made in every way but the announcing of it, simply nodded. I'll send word to the Fairy Tale envoy that further contact would be welcomed. Do that, Sylvanas said, and turned back to the window, watching her city's cookfires burn against an alien night sky, already turning over the next several moves in a game that had only just begun, and that she had no intention of losing. The formal council envoy arrived at Orgrimmar's gates 11 days after the city's arrival, and everything about the occasion had been engineered, with the particular anxious precision of career diplomats, to avoid repeating a single mistake of the previous, unofficial contact. There were 3 of them. Councilwoman Yajima's junior aide, a soft-spoken woman named Reyna Voss, who'd spent the better part of a decade specializing in inter-guild mediation, and had drawn the unenviable assignment of representing an entire kingdom to a queen who had already, by reputation, demonstrated exactly how little patience she had for wasted time. A translation specialist whose magic could parse unfamiliar linguistic structures in real time, though she'd admitted privately to Reyna that common seemed to translate cleanly enough that her services might prove largely ceremonial. And, at the council's insistence and very much against Makarov's private objections, an armed escort of 6 rune knights, present less for actual protection. Nobody seriously believed 6 knights could do anything against Orgrimmar's walls if matters went wrong, than for the optics of a kingdom that wished to appear neither defenseless nor desperate. Sylvanas received them with considerably more formal ceremony than she'd extended to Erza's team, which Reyna Voss, briefed thoroughly beforehand, understood correctly as a deliberate signal rather than genuine warmth. I take your kingdom seriously enough to perform the theater it expects. Don't mistake the theater for trust. The negotiations that followed, across 3 long days in Grommish Hold, established what would become the skeleton of Fiore and the Horde's early relationship. Careful, transactional, built on mutual utility, rather than any illusion of friendship. Fiore would recognize Orgrimmar's sovereignty over its own walls and internal governance, a concession the council chamber had argued over bitterly before conceding they had no practical alternative. In exchange, Sylvanas agreed to a set of restrictions on her patrol's operating radius, and, more significantly, though she framed it as pragmatism rather than goodwill, a commitment that Horde forces would not act against Fiore's citizens without cause, provided Fiore's citizens extended the same restraint. This is not friendship, Sylvanas told Reyna plainly, on the final day, as the broad strokes of the agreement were finalized. I want that understood clearly, so no one later claims I promised more than I did. This is 2 powers agreeing not to destroy each other by accident, while we each work out what the other actually is. Nothing more. I understand, War Chief, Reyna said, and meant it. She'd negotiated enough guild disputes to recognize honesty when it was offered, even honesty this cold. For what it's worth, I think that's a more useful foundation than a false peace would have been. Something flickered behind Sylvanas's red eyes at that. Not warmth, but a kind of grudging respect for a diplomat who hadn't tried to oversell the moment. You may be the first person from your kingdom I've met who understands that, she said. And it was, in its own way, the closest thing to a compliment Reyna Voss would receive during the entire negotiation. The formal treaty was signed on the third evening, copies sealed in both the council's official cipher and, at Zeltha's insistence, a small but telling gesture of the Horde's own bureaucratic pride, in the runic script of Horde diplomatic tradition. It would not end the tension between two worlds still learning each other's shapes, but it gave both sides, for the first time, a floor beneath the uncertainty, a set of rules neither party could claim ignorance of breaking. The reciprocal gesture, a delegation from Orgrimmar visiting Magnolia, and Fairy Tales Guildhall specifically, hadn't been part of the official treaty at all. It had come from Sylvanas herself, 3 days after the ink dried, in a message carried by one of Gruchthar's riders, directly to the guild, rather than through any council channel. You extended honesty when you had no obligation to. I would see the place that honesty came from. Makarov read the message twice, then laughed, a short, surprised bark of genuine amusement, and called the guild together to explain that, in approximately a week's time, Fairy Tale was going to be hosting a delegation from an entirely different world, and that everyone involved needed to, in his words, behave like the dignified professionals I know you're all capable of being, on the rare occasions you choose to be. The rare occasion did not, predictably, materialize. The delegation arrived on a bright, ordinary Magnolia morning. Zeltha Duskbrew, leading it this time rather than Gruchthar, accompanied by 2 younger Blood Elf attendants and, at Sylvanas's specific insistence, Kelger the Tauren, whose calm, steady presence she'd apparently judged would read as reassuring, rather than intimidating, to a population still nervous about anything resembling the Horde's more warlike races. It was, Zeltha privately suspected, also a small test. See how Fairy Tale's people reacted to a towering horned figure walking through their streets, and judge the guild's character by the reaction. The guild hall greeted them with the particular, chaotic warmth that was Fairy Tale's default setting for literally everything. Treaty or no treaty, world-ending stakes or none. Mirajane had baked, because Mirajane always baked when nervous, and this counted, by any reasonable measure, as an occasion. Kana had already decided the Blood Elf attendants looked like they needed a drink, and had said so within 4 minutes of their arrival, an assessment that turned out to be more accurate than diplomatic protocol probably intended. And Kelger, enormous, horned, entirely unlike anything Magnolia's ordinary population had ever seen walking calmly through its streets, spent the better part of an hour being fussed over by a small crowd of extremely enthusiastic children who had decided, with the swift and total confidence of children everywhere, that he was the single most interesting thing to happen to their town in years. They're not afraid of him, Zeltha observed, quietly, to Erza, watching Kelger crouch with visible care to let a delighted 7-year-old examine one of his horns up close. I expected fear. Fascination is unexpected. Kids don't know yet that they're supposed to be scared, Erza said, a faint smile crossing her usually composed features. Give it time. Some of them will grow into worrying about the wrong things. But right now, they just see something new, and new is exciting before it's ever frightening. A useful trait, Zeltha said, something thoughtful in her tone. One I wish more of my own people retained past childhood. The afternoon unfolded into something closer to genuine cultural exchange than either side had entirely planned for. Lucy spent the better part of 2 hours deep in conversation with one of Zeltha's attendants, a younger blood elf mage named Veril, comparing notes on celestial spirit summoning against arcane conjuration, in a discussion that grew steadily more technical and steadily more delighted the longer it went on, both of them scribbling diagrams on borrowed parchment that neither fully understood, but both found irresistible. Gray, predictably, ended up in an ice magic sparring match with Kelger in the guild's back lot. Informal, careful, no real intent to harm, that drew half the guild out to watch and ended in a good-natured draw neither party would concede. And Natsu spent most of the afternoon trying, with mounting and increasingly single-minded focus, to get anyone from Orgrimmar to tell him more about Azeroth's dragons. So there's like actual dragons, he pressed Zeltha, for perhaps the 4th time that day, Happy nodding along enthusiastically at his shoulder. Big ones, ancient ones. You said some of them are good and some of them are, what, monstrous? The dragon aspects, yes, Zeltha said, with the patience of someone who'd already fielded this exact question several times and had accepted it wasn't going away. Ancient guardians, tied to the fundamental forces of our world. Life, time, magic, earth, death. Some far more benevolent than others. Some. A flicker of old, careful grief crossed her expression, corrupted, twisted by grief or madness, into something far darker than they began as. Do they, Natsu hesitated, an unusual thing for him, the old ache surfacing again beneath the eagerness. Do they ever, take in kids, raise 'em, teach 'em stuff? Something in the specific phrasing made Zeltha look at him more closely, more carefully. Not that I've heard of, she said, gently, reading correctly that this question mattered more than the casual tone suggested. Why do you ask? Natsu was quiet a moment, the guild noise around them fading into background hum. My dad, he said finally, Igniel, he was a dragon. Raised me since I was a kid. After, he shrugged, a small, deliberately casual gesture that didn't quite land. It's a long story. Point is, I've been looking for him a long time, and when you guys said your world's got dragons too, I guess He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Zeltha considered him for a long moment, weighing something behind her glowing green eyes. I can't promise you answers, Natsu Dragneel, she said finally, careful and honest. Our worlds may share the word dragon, and nothing else beneath it. I genuinely don't know yet. But I'll take what you've told me back to our own lore masters, our own dragon scholars, if such knowledge exists to be compared. If there's a thread connecting your Igniel to anything in Azeroth's history, I promise you this, I will not be the one who lets it go unexamined. It wasn't the answer Natsu wanted, but something in the sincerity of it, the same careful, scholarly honesty she'd shown from the very first meeting in the woods, settled some of the old restless ache in his chest, at least for now. Thanks, he said, and meant it, and for once didn't push further. The day ended with the entire guild hall, Horde delegation included, gathered for what had, with the particular gravity-defying momentum of a fairy tale evening, turned into an impromptu feast, Mirajane's baking supplemented by whatever the guild's cooks could throw together on short notice, and more than a few of the guild's rowdier members attempting, with mixed success, to teach Kelger the words to a drinking song he clearly had no context for but sang along to anyway with tremendous, good-natured enthusiasm. Erza found Zeltha near the edge of the hall, watching the chaos with an expression that mixed genuine amusement with something more contemplative. Your world is strange, Zeltha said, when Erza settled beside her. Not in the ways I expected. I came prepared to assess a military threat, a magical rival, a political variable to be managed. I did not come prepared for, she gestured, vaguely, at the room, At Cana attempting to arm wrestle one of the younger elven attendants. At the singing. At the sheer unguarded warmth of it all. This, whatever this is just Tuesday, Erza said, a rare, genuine smile crossing her face. We're not always fighting something. Most days we're just this. That's the part I find hardest to categorize, Zeltha admitted. My own capital has warmth in it too. Don't mistake my surprise for condescension. But it's warmth built on the far side of centuries of hardship, hard won and carefully guarded. This feels, she searched for the word, unguarded, easy. As though the hardship simply hasn't found you yet, or as though you've decided not to let it change how you hold each other regardless. Maybe some of both, Erza said, honestly. We've had our share of loss. More than most would guess. Looking at us tonight, I think we just decided a long time ago that the answer to loss was more of this, not less. Zeltha was quiet for a moment, watching the room, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened into something more private than the careful diplomat's register she'd carried all day. The war chief will want a full report of everything I've observed here, she said. I intend to be thorough. But I think, a pause, choosing the words with unusual care, I think I will also tell her that whatever else this world turns out to be, this guild specifically, is not something Orgrimmar needs to fear. Whether that changes her calculus for the wider kingdom, I can't say, but it will change mine. That's more than we expected today, Erza said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Zeltha said, something wry entering her tone as she watched Kelger, 3 cups deep into a drink he clearly couldn't fully metabolize the effects of, attempt and fail to remember the 3rd verse of the drinking song for the 5th consecutive time. I still have to explain to the war chief why one of her most disciplined soldiers came home smelling of Fiore ale and unable to stop humming. Erza laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she rarely allowed in front of strangers, and for the first time since the sky had torn open over the Deadlands 11 days earlier, the distance between 2 worlds felt, for one warm and ordinary evening, a little smaller than it had that morning. But not everyone in Fiore had spent that evening in a guild hall making new friends over drinks and dragon lore. 300 miles south, in a fortress hidden deep within mountains no map acknowledged, a very different set of eyes had been watching the reports of Orgrimmar's arrival with considerably less warmth and considerably more calculation, and the Oraciones were not a group inclined to let an opportunity this large pass by untested. Nirvana had been sleeping for a long time when the world tore open 300 miles north of its resting place, but even asleep, the dark guild that guarded it had never stopped listening. The Oraciones operated from the shadows of Fiore's mountainous interior with the patience of people who measured their plans in years rather than days, and the 6 mages who led it, bound loosely by mutual ambition rather than any real loyalty to one another, had spent the 11 days since Orgrimmar's arrival doing what dark guilds did best, watching, calculating, and waiting for the moment when chaos became opportunity. Brain, the guild's nominal leader in all but name, had been the first among them to grasp the shape of what mattered. An entire foreign army, unaligned with the council, unaligned with any legal guild, sitting on Fiore's border like an unclaimed weapon, he said, standing before the ruined altar chamber where Nirvana's inert bulk waited beneath centuries of dust and dread. His voice carried the particular cold satisfaction of a man who had just watched an opportunity land in his lap fully formed. Do you understand what that represents, if it can be turned even partially to our purpose? Around him, the other 5 members of the Oraciones had gathered with varying degrees of interest. Cobra, with his usual predatory stillness, listening more to the sounds around him than the words themselves. Angel, distant and unreadable behind pale lashes. Racer, restless with the particular impatience that made him useless for anything requiring subtlety. Hot Eye, whose loyalties had always run in directions the others only half trusted, and Midnight, half asleep in the corner as always, seemingly indifferent to the entire conversation, despite absorbing every word of it. "You want to use them," Cobra said, not quite a question, his enhanced hearing already parsing something in Brain's tone that confirmed the thought before it was fully spoken. "I want to understand them first," Brain corrected, though the distinction was thinner than he pretended. A power that size doesn't arrive without weaknesses to exploit or ambitions to redirect. The kingdom's council will spend the next several months tangled in diplomacy and fear, too cautious to act decisively. Fairy Tale has already made itself the newcomer's preferred contact, which means the legal guilds are, for now, occupied elsewhere. His thin smile did not reach his eyes. That leaves the field remarkably clear for anyone patient enough to approach from an angle nobody else has considered. "And what angle is that?" Angel asked, her voice carrying the bored, precise disdain she extended to most conversations that didn't directly concern her own interests. "Nirvana requires enormous power to reawaken fully," Brain said, turning back toward the sleeping ruin behind him. "Power we have spent years accumulating in fragments, through means this guild need not revisit aloud, but a city of this scale, soldiers, mages, whatever this arcane energy actually is at its source, represents a font of raw magical potential, unlike anything native to Fiore, if even a fraction of that could be redirected, extracted, or otherwise acquired. Our timeline for Nirvana's completion could accelerate considerably." His eyes glittered with the specific hunger of a man who had waited a very long time for exactly this kind of unclaimed leverage to present itself. "I don't propose we announce ourselves as enemies. I propose we study them, quietly, patiently, the way Phantom Lord failed to, and find the crack in their defenses that a subtler approach can actually exploit." Cobra tilted his head, listening to something none of the others could hear. The distant, layered texture of sound that his enhanced senses alone could parse. "There's something under their magic," he said slowly. "I caught an edge of it 3 days back, when the wind shifted right. Something that doesn't sound like their soldiers or their scholars talking. Something older, angrier." Brain's attention sharpened instantly. "Explain." "Can't," Cobra admitted, frustration flickering across his usually flat expression. "It's faint, buried under everything else. But it's there. Something in that city that doesn't sound like the rest of what's arrived with it. Something that sounds like it's been waiting a very long time for someone to notice it." The chamber went quiet at that, 6 dangerous minds turning the same unsettling possibility over in parallel. "Then perhaps," Brain said finally, something almost delighted entering his cold voice, "our first move shouldn't be toward the war chief's soldiers at all. Perhaps it should be toward whatever she doesn't yet know is sleeping beneath her own new capital." He was not wrong to sense it, though he had no way yet of understanding what he'd actually caught the edge of. Deep beneath Orgrimmar, beneath even the oldest foundations of the Valley of Spirits, in a section of the Horde capital's substructure that predated the current city by generations, and had simply been carried along with everything else when the world tore, there existed a sealed chamber that even Sylvanas' own advisors had largely forgotten about. An old containment vault built during the Horde's earlier, less careful years to hold something too dangerous and too politically inconvenient to simply destroy. It had been quiet for a long time. It had, in fact, been quiet since before the current Horde leadership had ever set foot in Orgrimmar at all. A relic from an older regime, an older set of mistakes, sealed away and left to the dust because unsealing it had never once seemed worth the risk. But the tear that had ripped the city sideways into an entirely new world had not been a gentle transition. It had strained old wards, old seals, old bindings, that had held quietly and reliably for years, precisely because nothing had ever tested them since the day they were first laid. And in the aftermath of that strain, subtle, slow, easy to miss, amid the chaos of a city reorienting itself to an alien sky. Something in that old vault had begun, very quietly, to stir. Zeltha Duskbrew, whose curiosity ran deeper and wider than her official duties strictly required, had noticed the anomaly first, a strange resonance in her detection wards 3 days after the arrival, faint enough that she'd initially dismissed it as residual interference from the dimensional tear itself. It was only on the 5th day, running a more thorough diagnostic sweep of the city's oldest substructure, as part of her broader effort to understand how this new world's ambient Eternano interacted with Orgrimmar's own foundations, that she found the vault at all, buried in records so old and so deliberately obscure that even the war chief's own administrative archive barely acknowledged its existence. She had not yet reported it, not because she intended to hide it, but because the seal, whatever it guarded, remained, by every measurement her spells could take, fully intact, and raising an alarm over something that hadn't actually failed felt, to her scholarly instincts, premature. She had instead begun a quiet, careful study of her own, cross-referencing old Horde archival fragments, trying to understand what exactly had been sealed away beneath her city's new foundations, before deciding whether it was worth troubling the war chief with something that might, in the end, amount to nothing at all. It was, in retrospect, a reasonable and cautious instinct. It was also, unfortunately, exactly the kind of quiet, unassuming loose thread that a guild as patient as the Oración Seis specialized in finding and pulling. 3 weeks after Orgrimmar's arrival, life in Fiore had begun to settle, not into comfort, not yet, but into the specific, uneasy rhythm a world adopts when it's decided an impossible new fact of life isn't going away and has to be lived alongside rather than solved. Merchants had begun, cautiously, to test trade routes toward the new city's outer markets, encouraged by the treaty's terms and drawn by rumors of Horde craftsmanship. Orcish forgework in particular had developed an early, enthusiastic reputation among Fiore's smiths, who found the alien metallurgy both bewildering and fascinating in equal measure. Magnolia's children had taken to drawing wolf skull banners in their school notebooks with the same casual fascination they'd once reserved for dragons and knights. And the Magic Council, while still cautious, had begun the slow work of formalizing what had started as emergency diplomacy into something more resembling ordinary, if unusually careful, statecraft. Fairytale, for its part, had settled into an odd and increasingly comfortable role as the kingdom's unofficial cultural bridge to Orgrimmar, a position nobody had planned, and everybody had simply allowed to happen, given how naturally the guild's team had fallen into it from the very first contact. It was during this uneasy, hopeful lull, Lucy deep in her 3rd joint magical theory session with Veril, Gray and Kelger's ice sparring matches having become something of a recurring, informally scheduled event, Natsu still nursing his quiet hope about dragon lore that hadn't yet borne fruit, that the first sign of real trouble arrived, carried not by rumor this time, but by Zeltha Duskbrew herself, riding hard for Magnolia with an expression that had abandoned its usual scholarly composure entirely. She found Erza in the guild hall's training yard, mid-spar with Gray, and the urgency in her voice cut through the afternoon's easy rhythm like a blade. "I need to speak with your master," Zeltha said, breathless, having ridden without pause since dawn. "Now. It concerns something beneath my own city that I should have reported days ago, and I believe," she hesitated, old guilt and fresh fear warring visibly across her features, "I believe someone else may have already found it before I finished understanding what it was." Erza's blade lowered immediately, every trace of the sparring match's easy energy gone. "Found what?" "I don't fully know yet," Zeltha admitted, "but it's old, it's dangerous, and it's beginning to wake up. And I think, Erza," her voice dropped, grim and certain, I think we may have just discovered that Orgrimmar didn't only bring its army and its people into your world. It may have brought something else along with it. Something that was never meant to wake up at all. Makarov Dreyar had faced down demons, dark guilds, and the occasional apocalypse with a calm that had become, over the decades, something close to legendary within fairy tale. He listened to Zeltha Duskbrew's account of the sealed vault beneath Orgrimmar's oldest foundations, with that same outward calm, hands folded, expression unreadable, and it was only the faint whitening of his knuckles that betrayed how seriously he was taking it. "Tell me again what your archive said," he said, when she'd finished. "Precisely. Don't summarize. I want the words as they were written." Zeltha, seated across from him in his cramped guild hall office, with Erza standing near the door, and Natsu, Gray, and Lucy crowded in behind her, none of them willing to be left out of a briefing that had arrived with this much fear behind it, pulled a small scroll of notes from within her robes, her hand not quite steady. "The records are fragmentary," she admitted. "Whoever sealed the vault deliberately obscured most of the detail, a common practice, historically, when the Horde's leadership wanted something buried politically as well as physically. What remains reads, 'Contained herein, by joint decree, that which was drawn forth from beneath the earth in the old wars, and found too costly to destroy nor safe to wield. Let the seal hold until wiser hands than ours determine its fate.'" She looked up, meeting Makarov's steady gaze. "There's no name given. No description of what it actually is, just the seal itself, and the wards laid to maintain it. Wards which, until the world tore, had held without incident for longer than most of my own people have been alive." "And now?" Makarov asked. "Now they're straining," Zeltha said. "Not broken, not yet. But the tear that brought Orgrimmar into your world put a strain on every old binding beneath the city that nothing had tested in generations, and this one, whatever it is, was apparently laid down with power significant enough that even a partial strain registers clearly on any careful detection working. I found it by accident, running an unrelated survey. I don't know how long it's been weakening before that. Days, possibly longer." "You said someone else may have found it too," Erza said, quiet and precise. "What made you think that?" Zeltha's expression tightened. 2 nights ago, one of the junior ward keepers I'd assigned to monitor the seal reported unusual movement near the old substructure entrance. Sealed off, officially abandoned, nowhere anyone should have reason to be. When he investigated, he found signs of recent digging near an access point that predates even Orgrimmar's current layout. Careful digging, professional. Whoever did it knew precisely where to look, which means they had knowledge of that vault's existence that even most of my own city's current leadership doesn't possess. She met Makarov's eyes squarely. "I don't believe that's coincidence. I believe someone in your world learned of this vault's existence faster than my own people did, and I have no idea how." The room went quiet at that, the implications settling over all of them at once. "Dark Guild," Gray said finally, flatly. "Has to be. Somebody's been watching this whole situation since day one, looking for an angle nobody else thought of." "The Oración Seis," Erza said, and something in her voice carried the particular grimness of long, hard-won experience with that name specifically. "They're the only group in Fiore patient enough, and connected enough, to have found something this deeply buried this quickly. If it's them, then whatever's sealed in that vault is exactly the kind of leverage they'd want." Makarov finished, his usual mild expression gone entirely now, replaced by the harder, older look that surfaced only when he judged a threat genuinely serious. "Zeltha, does your war chief know yet?" "Not yet," Zeltha admitted, and there was real shame in the admission. "I came to you first. I hoped a second perspective, someone with experience of this world's dangers rather than my own, might help me understand what we're actually facing, before I bring an unconfirmed fear to the war chief and risk either underselling or overselling the danger to her." "That was a mistake," Makarov said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Sylvanas needs to know now, not after we've all had time to theorize. Whatever's sleeping beneath her city, it's her city, and she has every right to decide how her own people respond to a threat inside their own walls." He was already rising, moving with more urgency than his short stature usually suggested. "But you were right to bring this to us as well. If the Oración Seis are involved, this isn't purely an Orgrimmar matter anymore. It's a Fiore matter too, and one this guild has more history with than most." "I'll go with her," Erza said immediately. "If Sylvanas is going to hear this, she should hear it from someone who already has her measure, and from someone who understands exactly what the Oración Seis are capable of. Take Natsu, Gray, and Lucy as well," Makarov said. "If there's any truth to Cobra's instincts," a grim nod toward Zeltha, who'd relayed that detail with particular unease, about something old and angry beneath that city. "I'd rather my strongest team be standing there when it's confirmed, than racing to catch up after the fact." They reached Orgrimmar by nightfall, riding hard, and found the city in a state of quiet, controlled alarm that told them Sylvanas had, in the hours since Zeltha's departure, clearly begun her own investigation regardless of whether the formal report had reached her yet. She met them in Grommish Hold with none of the ceremonial distance of their first audience. This time, the moment they entered, she was already moving toward them, red eyes sharp with an intensity that made even Natsu's usual bravado quiet itself. "You found something beneath my city," she said to Zeltha, before anyone else could speak, "and you took 3 days deciding whether to tell me. I take full responsibility for that delay, War Chief," Zeltha said, not flinching, though her voice carried genuine contrition. "I judged the threat unconfirmed and didn't wish to raise unnecessary alarm. That judgment was wrong. I've brought Fairy Tale because I believe this concerns both our worlds now, not just one." Sylvanas's gaze moved to Erza, cataloging the presence of the full team, rather than the single envoy she might have expected. "Then tell me what you believe, all of you, and tell me quickly. My own scouts confirmed the disturbance an hour before your rider reached the gate. Whatever's down there, it's no longer merely straining. Something moved within the last hour, deliberately." The room went very still. "Someone's already down there," Erza said. "Or something is trying very hard to get out," Sylvanas said, cold and precise. "I don't yet know which, and I intend to find out immediately." She turned, already moving toward the doors, her voice carrying the particular flat authority of a commander who had made her decision the instant the threat became concrete, rather than theoretical. "Grukthar. Full garrison alert. Quiet channels only. I don't want panic in the streets before we understand what we're dealing with. Zeltha, you're with me. I want your wards active the moment we reach the vault. And you," her gaze swept back over the Fairy Tale team, weighing something for a brief, calculating moment. "You came prepared for a fight, or you wouldn't have ridden through the night to get here. If there's a hostile presence beneath my own city, I won't refuse capable hands, simply because they weren't born to it." "We're in," Natsu said immediately, fire already curling faintly at his knuckles, the old restless hunger for a real fight lighting up behind his eyes despite the gravity of the situation. "Then move," Sylvanas said, and led them down, into the old heart of a city that had carried more secrets across the tear between worlds than anyone, Horde or Fairy Tale, had yet fully understood. The substructure beneath Orgrimmar's Valley of Spirits was older than the city's current architecture by generations, a maze of half-collapsed tunnels and forgotten chambers that predated even the current Horde leadership's earliest records, and descending into it felt, to Lucy's already frayed nerves, like walking backward through time into something the present city had deliberately chosen to forget. The air changed as they went deeper, colder, heavier, carrying a faint mineral tang that reminded Gray uncomfortably of the deepest, oldest caves he'd ever explored. Places where the world felt like it remembered things that had happened long before anyone currently alive had been born to witness them. Zeltha's rune staff cast a steady green glow ahead of the group, her detection wards active and pulsing faintly with every step, growing steadily more agitated the closer they drew to whatever lay ahead. "There," she said finally, as the tunnel opened into a wider chamber, and the source of the disturbance became visible at last. The vault door stood at the chamber's far end, massive, ancient, carved with runes that even Zeltha admitted she couldn't fully translate. The accumulated dust of generations disturbed in a wide, recent swath leading directly to it, and embedded in the seal itself, glowing an angry, pulsing red where it had clearly begun to crack, was a fracture that hadn't existed, by Zeltha's own account, even 2 days earlier. But it wasn't the fracture that made every member of the party stop cold in the chamber's entrance. It was the 6 figures already gathered before it, robed and hooded, magic crackling faintly around a working that had clearly been in progress for some time. And the 6th of them, Cobra, whose head snapped up the instant their footsteps echoed into the chamber, his enhanced hearing catching their arrival long before anyone else's would have. "Well," Brain said, turning from the fractured seal with a thin, unbothered smile, as though he'd been expecting this exact interruption and had simply been waiting to see how promptly it arrived. The war chief herself, and Fairy Tale's finest, all in one convenient chamber. "How efficient of you to save us the trouble of arranging separate confrontations." Sylvanas's bow was already off her back, an arrow knocked with a speed that made even Natsu blink. "You have exactly one chance to explain why you're standing in front of a seal that has held for generations, moments before it began to fail," she said, voice carrying the particular cold finality that had, by reputation, ended arguments far more reasonable than whatever excuse Brain intended to offer. "Choose your words carefully." "I don't believe I need to explain anything," Brain said, entirely unbothered, "given that you've already arrived too late to stop what's already begun." His smile widened, cold and satisfied. "Whatever your ancestors sealed away down here, Warchief, it spent generations gathering hunger in the dark. And we've spent 3 weeks patiently feeding it exactly the kind of attention it's been waiting for." Behind him, the fracture in the vault door pulsed, brighter this time, wider, and from somewhere deep within the sealed chamber beyond it, something ancient and furious began, at long last, to stir. The fracture widened with a sound like grinding bone, and for one suspended, terrible moment, everyone in the chamber, Horde and Fairy Tale alike, simply stared, weapons half raised, as the ancient seal Zeltha's ancestors had trusted to hold for generations, finally gave up the fight it had been quietly losing since the moment the world tore. "Move," Sylvanas's voice cracked through the chamber like a whip, and the discipline of command took over before conscious thought could. "Zeltha, reinforce what's left of that ward, now. Everyone else." She didn't finish the order, because the vault door tore itself open from the inside. What came through it was not, immediately, a shape so much as a pressure. A wave of cold, ancient malice that hit the chamber like a physical force, guttering half the torches along the walls and sending a visible shudder through even Kelger's massive, steady frame. Lucy staggered back a step, hand instinctively closing around Loke's key, though her fingers had gone numb with the sudden drop in temperature. Natsu's fire flared instinctively brighter, an old animal instinct pushing back against a cold that had nothing to do with weather. Then the shape resolved, and it was worse than the pressure had suggested. It had been humanoid once, perhaps, the vague architecture of a torso, limbs, a ruin of a face. But centuries in that seal had twisted whatever it had originally been into something closer to a wound-given form, translucent and shifting, edges bleeding into shadow that didn't quite hold still even when nothing else in the chamber moved. Where its eyes should have been, there was only a deeper darkness, and when it opened what might charitably be called a mouth, the sound that came out was not a roar, so much as 100 smaller sounds layered together. Voices, Lucy realized with a lurch of horror. Dozens of half-formed voices, all speaking at once, all saying nothing anyone could parse. "An old grief-bound," Sylvanas said, low and grim, arrow already loosed and burying itself in the creature's shifting mass with an impact that visibly rippled through it without appearing to do meaningful damage. "I know what this is. I didn't know one had ever been sealed here." "You recognize it?" Erza called, already requipping into heavier armor, blade gleaming. "By type, not by name," Sylvanas said. "Something forged from mass, unresolved death, the kind of thing that forms when too many people die together, badly, with grievance left unspoken. My people learned to seal these rather than destroy them, generations ago, because destroying them outright only scatters the grief they're made of back into whatever ground absorbs it." Her second arrow found the creature's center mass, and this time it recoiled, the layered voices rising into something closer to a shriek. "Which means this thing does not die easily, and everyone in this chamber needs to understand that before it finishes waking fully." "Should have mentioned that before I got excited," Natsu muttered, though the fire around his fists had only grown brighter, more focused. "Don't suppose it's got a soft spot?" "I don't know yet," Sylvanas said. "But we're about to find out, because it isn't waiting for us to prepare." The grief-bound surged forward, not with the coordinated aggression of a trained fighter, but with the chaotic, undirected violence of pure accumulated anguish, given the sudden freedom of movement, limbs of shifting shadow lashing out in every direction at once. Kelger caught the first blow meant for Zeltha, bracing with a grunt of effort as something cold and heavy connected with his raised arm, the impact staggering him back a full step despite his considerable bulk. "That's not right," he growled, shaking out the arm. "Feels like grief, moves like a landslide." "Focus fire," Erza called, already moving, blade flashing as she closed the distance. "Whatever this thing's made of, it still has mass. Hit it hard enough, and it has to give somewhere." Gray was already moving too, ice magic crystallizing along both forearms. "Ice make, lance." A volley of crystalline spears tore through the air, catching the creature's shifting bulk, and for a brief moment, actually holding. A lattice of frost spreading across the shadow mass, slowing its next lunge, just enough for Kelger to recover his footing. "It doesn't like the cold," Gray said, grim satisfaction cutting through the tension. "Good to know." "Then let's make it colder," Natsu said, and for once didn't sound entirely thrilled by the prospect of restraint. But something in Sylvanas's warning had gotten through even his usual eagerness for a straightforward brawl. "Fire won't touch it?" "Fire's a guess," Sylvanas said, loosing another arrow, this one aimed for what might have been the creature's throat if it had possessed one. "Try it and find out. Just don't stand still while you do." Natsu didn't need telling twice. Fire dragons roar. The blast of flame crashed into the shifting mass, and unlike the ice, seemed to simply pass through it, scattering the shadow substance briefly apart before it reformed, angrier, the layered voices rising into something closer to a genuine scream of fury. "Okay, fire makes it mad," Natsu said, ducking a wild swipe of shadow limb that would have taken his head off. Nodded. "It's not a normal creature," Zeltha called, her staff blazing as she worked to stabilize what remained of the shattered seal, sweat beading despite the chamber's cold. "It doesn't have a body to injure in any conventional sense. It's grief, given enough shape to lash out, and grief doesn't respond to force the way flesh does. We need to either bind it again or—" She hesitated, the only alternative clearly costing her something to voice. or resolve whatever grievance is holding it together in the first place. Neither is fast. We don't have fast, Erza said, parrying a shadow limb with her blade in a shower of cold sparks. We have now. Can you rebind it, even partially, while we hold it here? I can try, Zeltha said. But the original seal took a full working of 6 of my order's founders, generations ago. I am one mage, and the fracture's already. Then you're not alone, Sylvanas cut in, already moving toward her, red eyes hard with decision. Hold your focus. I'll lend what I can. Across the chamber, Brain watched the unfolding chaos with the cold, patient satisfaction of a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as intended, making no move to intervene, no move to flee, simply observing, cataloging, waiting. Aren't you going to help your monster along? Gray shouted at him, between exchanges, frustration cutting through his usual composure. It requires no further help from me, Brain said, almost pleasant about it. I've done what was needed. 3 weeks of careful, patient feeding, small offerings of grief and anger, drawn from the surrounding town's own fear of your new neighbors, channeled precisely where an old wound waited to receive them. The seal was always going to fail eventually. I simply ensured it failed on my schedule, not yours. His eyes glittered with cold amusement. Now I intend to observe how thoroughly it consumes both a war chief's pride and a legal guild's reputation, and decide from the wreckage what's worth salvaging afterward. That's not a plan, Erza snarled, blocking another wild swing. That's cowardice with extra steps. Call it what you like, Brain said. I've learned patience yields considerably more than bravado ever has. Beside him, Cobra's head tilted, listening to something none of the others could parse. And for the first time since the confrontation began, something like genuine unease crossed his usually flat expression. Brain, he said low. It's not just angry anymore. Something in there's recognizing something, recognizing someone. Brain's cold composure flickered, just slightly, for the first time. Recognizing whom? Cobra's eyes moved, slow and deliberate toward Sylvanas, toward the particular, unmistakable texture of death that clung to a banshee queen, unlike anything else in the chamber. Her, he said. The grief-bound stopped mid-lunge, its shapeless mass shuddering, the 100-layered voices within it suddenly, eerily coalescing into something almost coherent. A single word, broken and repeated, rising out of the chaos of grief, like a drowning thing, finally breaking the surface. Sister! Every eye in the chamber turned to Sylvanas, whose arrow, for the first time since the fight began, did not fly. Sylvanas Windrunner had faced down demons, gods, and the horrors of her own extended unlife, without her composure cracking in front of subordinates. It cracked now, for exactly as long as it took her to draw one sharp, unnecessary breath, the old useless habit of a body that no longer needed air, but still remembered wanting it, before she forced the stillness back into her face by sheer, practiced will. That's not possible, she said, and her voice, for the first time since the fairy tale team had met her, did not sound entirely certain. War Chief? Grukthar's voice carried real alarm now, weapon still raised but eyes flicking between her and the shuddering, half-coherent mass of shadow before them. This vault, Sylvanas said slowly, working through it even as she spoke, predates the current administration by generations. Whoever sealed it did so before I ever set foot in Orgrimmar as anything but a soldier of a different banner entirely. Her red eyes narrowed at the creature, some old and private calculation working behind them. I have sisters, Grukthar, had, Alaria, Barisa, a pause, colder, and Lireth, though he was no sister of mine to speak of. It's not naming a person, Zeltha said quickly, still bracing the crumbling ward with visible effort, sweat now cutting tracks through the dust on her face. Grief-bound don't carry precise memory the way the living do, They absorb impressions, fragments, the emotional residue of whoever or whatever they consumed in their formation. If this thing is echoing sister, it may not mean it recognizes you specifically. It may simply mean whatever grief it was built from once belonged to someone who lost a sister, or was a sister, and something about your nature as Banshee is close enough in shape that it's latching on to the resemblance. That is either a great comfort, Sylvanas said, flat, or an even worse possibility than the one I was considering, and I genuinely cannot tell which. The creature lurched forward again, the coherence of its single word dissolving back into the layered chaos of 100 smaller voices, and the fight resumed its earlier desperate shape. Erza's blade, Grey's ice, Kelger's bracing bulk, Natsu circling for an opening that didn't punish him for using fire, but something had shifted in the chamber's tension now, a thread of genuine unease running through even Sylvanas's usual icy composure. Whatever it is, Erza called, parrying another wild strike. We can't hold this stalemate forever. Zeltha, how close are you to a partial rebind? Close, Zeltha gritted out, her staff blazing brighter, runes forming and reforming faster than Lucy's eye could properly track. I need something to anchor the binding to. The original seal held because it was tied to a specific grievance, resolved or at least acknowledged by someone with standing to acknowledge it. A blind rebind won't hold as long. I need someone it recognizes to speak to it directly, or this fractures again within days. Speak to it, Sylvanas repeated, something grim settling into her expression as the implication landed. You want me to address it? I want whoever it's fixated on to address it, Zeltha said. If that's you, and it seems unfortunately that it might be, then yes, I need you to try. Sylvanas's jaw tightened, an old and private cost visibly working behind her eyes that none of the fairy tale team, watching, fully understood the shape of. But she lowered her bow, slowly, deliberately, and stepped forward into the creature's reach, a move that drew a sharp, alarmed shout from Grukthar and a tensing from every fighter in the chamber, weapons still half raised, ready to intervene the instant it looked like a mistake. I don't know what you were, Sylvanas said, her voice carrying that same doubled register, low and steady, aimed directly at the shifting mass of shadow now looming, strangely still, above her. I don't know whose grief made you, or what sister you lost, or whether anything of the person you once were survives inside whatever you've become. But I know what it is to be made into something other than what you started as. I know what it is to have your grief outlive the reasons for it, twisted into something that only knows how to lash out at whatever's nearest. A pause, and something in her tone, cold as it remained, carried an unmistakable weight of shared understanding. That doesn't have to be all you are. It wasn't all I was, in the end. Whatever bound you here did so believing you could be held, not destroyed. I intend to honor that judgment, if you'll let me. The chamber held its breath, Natsu's fire dimming to a low, watchful flicker, Grey's ice lance lowering fractionally, Erza's blade steady but not advancing, as the grief-bound's shifting mass slowed, the 100-layered voices quieting, one by one, into something closer to silence. For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened at all. Then the creature's shapeless form curled inward, not in aggression this time, but in something closer to exhaustion, the shadow substance folding into itself with a sound like a long, released breath. And Zeltha, seizing the opening with the focused desperation of a scholar who understood exactly how brief it would be, drove her staff down hard against the chamber floor, runes blazing white-hot as the fractured seal's remaining structure surged back to life, wrapping around the diminishing creature in bands of pale light. Now, she gritted out, sweat streaming. Hold. The seal closed with a final grinding shudder, the last visible wisps of shadow drawn back through the vault door as it groaned shut once more, the ancient runes flaring bright, then dim, then finally, mercifully, dark and quiet. Silence settled over the chamber, broken only by the ragged breathing of 6 exhausted fighters and the faint, residual crackle of dissipating magic. Erza turned first, blade still raised, toward the corner where Brain and the rest of the Oración Seis had stood watching the entire confrontation unfold. The corner was empty. They were gone, vanished sometime during the chaos of the fight, slipping away the moment their gambit had clearly failed to deliver the catastrophe they'd been hoping to observe. Cowards, Gray spat, breathing hard, lowering his stance. They just left their monster to do the work and ran the second it started losing. They didn't run because it lost, Erza said grimly, sheathing her blade. They ran because they got what they actually wanted: information. They know now that this world's oldest secrets can be weaponized, that Orgrimmar has vulnerabilities buried in its own foundations, and that a fight here draws exactly the kind of chaos they profit from. This wasn't a failure for them, Gray. This was reconnaissance. Sylvanas, still standing near the now sealed vault door, said nothing for a long moment, her red eyes fixed on the ancient runes settling back into dormancy, some old and private weight visibly pressing on her that she made no effort to explain to the room. "Zeltha," she said finally, voice carefully even. "Full report on that vault's origins, however long it takes. Every fragment of record we still hold. I want to know exactly what my predecessors thought they were sealing, and why they believed it could be reasoned with rather than destroyed." "Understood, Warchief," Zeltha said, still catching her breath, though something in her tone suggested she'd already begun forming theories she wasn't yet ready to voice aloud. Sylvanas turned, finally, to Erza and the rest of the fairy tale team, and for a moment something almost like genuine gratitude flickered behind her usual icy composure, before she buried it back beneath the Queen's practiced control. "You didn't have to come tonight. You came anyway, and fought for a threat that wasn't yours to bear." A pause, weighing the words carefully. "I won't forget that. We didn't come because we owed you anything," Erza said. "We came because a threat to your city was quickly becoming a threat to ours too. But I won't pretend I'm not glad we did." Sylvanas's mouth curved, faint and humorless, but not unkind. "No, I imagine you're not." Her gaze drifted once more toward the sealed vault, and something older and heavier than the night's fight settled behind her eyes. "This isn't finished. Whatever that thing was, whatever it meant by sister, I intend to find out. And whoever those 6 mages were, working in the shadows of my own city's oldest wound," her voice hardened, cold and absolute, "I intend to make certain they regret having found it first." Behind them, deep beneath Orgrimmar's ancient foundations, the sealed vault settled once more into an uneasy quiet, bought, for now, at considerable cost, and carrying with it questions that neither world yet had the answers to. The days following the confrontation beneath Orgrimmar moved faster than anyone expected, as if both worlds had finally accepted that they no longer had the luxury of easing into each other slowly. Zeltha's research into the vault's origins turned up what fragments remained of the old records, and though much of the truth stayed buried with whoever had sealed it generations ago, the picture that emerged was clear enough to matter. A grief-bound born from an old tragedy nobody now living had witnessed, sealed rather than destroyed by leaders who'd believed, rightly or not, that even grief deserved a chance at eventual peace instead of annihilation. Sylvanas ordered the vault reinforced, this time with wards drawn from both worlds' knowledge. Zeltha's arcane craft, interwoven with a working Erza, had insisted Fairy Tale's own rune specialists contribute, a small, deliberate act of 2 civilizations choosing to solve a shared problem together, rather than separately. The Oración Seis did not resurface immediately, and Sylvanas made no secret of her intention to hunt them down properly, rather than let the matter rest. An intention the Magic Council, once briefed, found itself unable to argue with, given how thoroughly the Dark Guild had exploited a wound neither kingdom nor horde had known existed. It marked, in its own quiet way, the first true cooperative effort between two governments still learning to trust each other. A joint task force, unofficial and uneasy but genuine, formed to track down 6 mages who had proven, in a single night, exactly how dangerous the gaps between two unfamiliar worlds could be if left unwatched. For Fairy Tale, the fight changed something quieter and more personal. Natsu never got his answer about Igniel that night, and he understood, with unusual patience, that he might not get one for a long while yet. But Zeltha kept her promise, carrying his story back to Orgrimmar's own lore masters, and somewhere in that exchange, a door that hadn't existed a month earlier had opened, however slightly, onto the possibility that his search wasn't over, so much as it had simply gained a second world to search in. And Sylvanas, cold, calculating, still fundamentally unwilling to call anything as soft as friendship by its name, found herself, in the weeks that followed, sending word to Fairy Tale more often than strict necessity required. Not alliance, not yet trust, fully. But something had shifted the night a guild of strangers had stood beside her against a threat that was entirely her own to bear, and chosen to stay anyway. 2 worlds, torn together by an accident neither had asked for, had not become one. But they had stopped, for the first time since the sky split open the Deadlands, treating each other as strangers waiting to become enemies, and had started, cautiously, treating each other as something that might, given enough time and enough nights like this one, become worth calling neighbors instead. The story of what happened next, the hunt for 6 mages who knew too much, the slow thaw between a warchief and a guild who'd earned her guarded respect, whatever answers still waited in Azeroth's own dragon lore, would be told another time. For now, Orgrimmar's banners still flew over Fiore's eastern hills, and Fairy Tale's lights still burned warm in Magnolia, and for one hard-won night, both worlds slept a little easier than they had the evening before.